So, what we're going to do here is listen. We're going to listen to some of the last living voices from the Second World War. These are deeply personal stories that, are getting rarer with every single day that passes. These aren't just dates and facts from a textbook. They're real, lived experiences. And honestly, it's a privilege to hear them. And this is the perfect place to start, with this hesitation, this reluctance. This quote from Army veteran William Anderson, it just cuts right to the heart of it all. For so many of these men, the memories weren't some tale of glory they'd share at a bar. No, they were heavy burdens, things they carried, mostly in silence, for decades. And you've probably heard this term before, right? The greatest generation. It was coined by the journalist Tom Brokaw, and it's a powerful label. It brings up this image of quiet strength, of people who endured the Great Depression and then went on to fight a world war. It defined them. And that brings us to the really crucial question here. Out of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II, just a tiny fraction are still with us. That window to hear these stories from the source is closing fast. So it really makes you think, what do we lose when we can no longer hear their voices directly? Now, you might think that for the millions who served, the story of why they joined is pretty straightforward. Patriotism, duty. But the journey into the military, well, it was as complex and varied as the people themselves. I mean, just look at this contrast. It's really striking. On the one hand, you have the common narrative we all know, signing up after Pearl Harbor to defend freedom. But then you have William Anderson's reality. He was a kid trying to survive the Depression by bootlegging whiskey. He gets arrested, and a judge gives him a choice: go to jail or join the army. So for him, duty didn't start with a patriotic poster. It started with a plea bargain. For so many of these young guys, that jarring leap from civilian to military life happened almost instantly. And it wasn't about gunfire or battle at first. Nope. It was the simple, and often pretty brutal, logistics of just getting there. This memory from Marine Fred D. Domenico about his trip to Paris Island is just so incredibly vivid. Can you imagine that? You're leaving home maybe for the very first time, and you get jammed into what he literally calls a cattle truck. It's this sudden dehumanizing smack in the face, a very clear signal that your life as an individual was over. And that new life is part of a unit. It was about to be tested in ways that no amount of training could ever truly prepare them for. Boot camp was tough, for sure, but the battlefield was a whole other level of unimaginable. So before Fred D. Domenico ever even saw a real battle, an instructor gave his platoon a little demonstration. He made them run from a pretend boat to the beach while other guys threw rocks at them. It was total chaos, and it came with a chilling message. 70%. That's the number the instructor gave them. He told them flat out that 70% of them would not make it through their first combat landing. And Di Domenico's reaction? He said, "I knew I was in big trouble. I said, okay, I'll be the best Marine I can be, and maybe I can be in the 30%. And that statistic became horrifyingly real. On November 1st, 1943, Di Domenico was in that first wave at Bougainville. 42 guys crammed into one landing craft. And before they even reached the sand, a Japanese shell hit them. His memory of it is just this nightmare blur: bodies, limbs, red water. He has no idea how he even got to the shore, only that out of 42 men, he was one of only 6 who survived. That was his hello to combat. So while men like Di Domenico were fighting one enemy, hundreds of thousands of black soldiers were fighting a completely different war at the exact same time. It was a war against prejudice, inside their own military, and inside their own country. Reverend Howard Gray's story is it's a painful, powerful example. He's on his way home, a proud sergeant in the U.S. Army, wearing his uniform. And at a bus station in Texarkana, Texas, he tries to get a drink of water and gets assaulted for it, knocked right in the mouth. He's standing there, a soldier fighting for his country, while being denied the most basic human dignity by that same country. And this wasn't some one-off thing. Robert E. Renshaw said he saw more blatant racism in the segregated army than he'd seen in his entire life growing up in an integrated neighborhood. It was this crazy contradiction that he just couldn't wrap his head around, being asked to die for a country that treated you like a second-class citizen. So whether it was from combat or from injustice, the war left scars, deep ones. And for the nurses and doctors who cared for the soldiers coming home, the sheer scale of the trauma, both physical and mental, was just immense. Navy nurse Mildred Shaper saw it all. I mean, just look at the range of her assignments. She'd be in the maternity ward seeing new life begin, and then she'd be moved to the psych ward, or the malaria ward, or the surgical unit dealing with the horrific injuries from battles like Okinawa. She saw the entire brutal spectrum of what war does to people. You have to remember, the journey from a battlefield in the Pacific to a hospital in California could take weeks. And in that time, an injury could get a lot worse in some really horrifying ways. Nurse Shaper told a story about one young Marine who came back from Okinawa. The reality was just so grim. When they finally cut his cast off, a cast that was put on in the field, they found it was filled with maggots. I know, it's a graphic, visceral image, but it tells you everything about the conditions these men suffered through and that long, agonizing journey just to get care. So the big question is, how did these men and women carry these experiences, the good, the bad, the absolutely unimaginable, into the rest of their lives? Their service didn't just stop when the war ended, it shaped everything that came next for them and for the country. You know, one of the most brilliant things to come out of that whole era was the GI Bill. For millions of veterans who never in their wildest dreams thought they could go to college, it was a lifeline. It didn't just rebuild lives, you could argue it built the modern American middle class. It was a total game changer. Just look at Robert Renshaw's journey. This is the same man who was stunned by the prejudice he saw in the Army. He gets discharged in January of '46. By that June, he's enrolled in pre-law, all thanks to the GI Bill. He goes on to become an attorney, and he spends his life fighting the exact kind of injustice he endured. His service literally became the motivation for his life's work. And I think, in the end, that's the real power here. Reverend Howard Gray just said it so perfectly. These aren't Hollywood war stories. They are stories about war, from the people who actually lived it. It's human truth, raw, unvarnished, and absolutely unforgettable. And that is exactly why the work of places like the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project, which is where these interviews actually came from, is just so vital. They are literally in a race against time to create this archive to make sure these voices don't just fade away into silence. Hearing their experiences, it really makes you take a step back and think, doesn't it? They lived through this massive, world-defining moment, and it shaped everything that followed. So it kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. When our time is up, what stories will we have lived, and what will we leave behind?